So this little guy that you can see here was sent to me under the suspicion that it was killing plants and that it is a parasitic plant nematode. It was really, really difficult to find any evidence of these little guys, even after doing a nematode extraction. That's because these worms are quite large, and during a nematode extraction, they must move through a filter paper in order to be collected in the liquid. It is actually quite large in comparison to most nematodes. This one is probably about 3, if that, millimeters long. And I was able to take a video with the iPhone on a macro setting, and then I've put it under the microscope. My suspicion has been that given the size of the creature, it was too large to be a nematode, even though plant parasitic nematodes can be quite large. The worm you can see here now is under the microscope, as it is being viewed under 40 times magnification in this case here. But this one was visible with the naked eye. Plant parasitic nematodes usually need to be viewed under a microscope. Usually for nematodes, you will use at least 100 times magnification and all the way up to 400 times to identify their mouth parts and see whether there are piercing mouth parts on the organism. And this is an example of a plant parasitic nematode. A root-feeding nematode is another way we can label these organisms, and you can see where the mouth part is, there is this stylet, this tube at the tip of its mouth, and there's like a little bulb on the bottom of that tube, which is a muscle that pushes the stylet or the spear, the piercing mouth part, into the plant with quite a force to actually puncture plant cells. So this is a root-feeding nematode that is viewed under 400 times magnification. And this is a view of it under 200 times magnification, so that you can see the entire creature there. So this is quite a large organism, and you can see that it's actually segmented. There are repetitive parts of its body morphology. Nematodes are actually quite smooth. They are unsegmented worms, so they don't have these repetitive segments that this worm has. And they've got little, you can see these little setae, these little hairs on this worm as well. And there are definitely no piercing mouth parts on the organism, so they're more likely to be feeding on the microbes like fungi, bacteria, and protozoa that feed on the debris and the organic matter that they're breaking down. So this is definitely not a nematode. The other indication that it might not have been a plant parasitic nematode was that these worms were introduced with dam water being used in a nursery during the drought time when bore water was running out. And of course, plant parasitic nematodes are not likely to live in water, in dams. However, it is possible that some eggs might have come into the water from a neighboring farm. And there's plenty of evidence that irrigation water can be contaminated with plant parasitic nematodes. But that was still a very big clue to me that these organisms might not be nematodes, that the problem is not a nematode problem. Additionally, the sample was sent in a bag where the plants were added into the potting mix. I examined all the roots that were in there, and the nematodes just weren't there. The animals were just not around the roots at all. In fact, they were dispersed all over the place, so I really couldn't find any. It's just a thought that dropped into my head later that maybe the only way I'll be able to find them if one, by some sheer chance, will actually get stuck onto the bag itself. And of course there was one because you're looking at it here. But usually if it's a plant parasitic nematode, they will be still associated with the plants. And usually they want a photosynthetic plant to be sucking the sugars from the plant. So a plant that is still photosynthesizing, not a dead plant. And all these plants were already dead for some time. They're already decomposing. So that's another clue that it was not a plant parasitic nematode. And I did find some evidence for these worms in strawberry plants, there is mention of them being aquatic as well as terrestrial, so they can live in water. So it is likely that these organisms came from the dam. And at the same time, the article mentions how they are completely harmless and they're not plant parasitic, which makes sense, and it all adds up given how these worms arrived into the potting mix. Here is also a video from the same sample of an actual nematode. And this is a bacterial feeding nematode, and it's viewed under 100 times magnification here, but you can see how it is unsegmented and it has a very smooth body and is very transparent as well. These little guys have mouth parts adapted to bacterial feeding, feeding on bacteria, and they're essential in nutrient cycling. So they're very beneficial, and we want a lot of these in the soil in order to cycle nutrients as they feed on bacteria and release plant available nutrients. By consuming bacteria, they actually release the excess nutrients they get from the bacteria and therefore feed plants directly. So I've made this little video to put George and Stephanie, who were worried about having nematodes in their nursery, at ease that this is actually just a worm and it is actually quite beneficial to have in the soil, as it will be cycling some nutrients from the debris and the bacteria that it feeds on from the organic matter, and that these are not the problem. And the problem in the potting mix feels like, from what I've seen under the microscope, that the substrate is quite wet and it might be causing some rot of the plants. And you can see from the video here that I've recorded some other organisms after the nematode extraction that proliferated while left in the stagnant water from the nematode extraction. And even though these are quite prolific, they're not as prolific in the actual potting mix sample. However, I did see some of these, even though they weren't as prolific, but these organisms indicate reduced oxygen conditions. So that is not good for plants. They require oxygen. And you can see this gorgeous creature in the middle there. It's called the rotifer. And the other ones are ciliates, all the round little beauties that swim around. And both of these organisms indicate reduced oxygen conditions. And this is what the problem might be in this potting mix, that if it gets too wet, there isn't enough oxygen. And these organisms start to flourish just to eat up the excess bacteria that begins to grow when oxygen is reduced. So just having them in the samples indicates the beginnings of anaerobic conditions forming. And in this particular video, you can see these very thin filaments in the background, which are actually water molds, or otherwise called oomycetes. And these organisms, when they begin to proliferate, can actually be quite detrimental to the plant. And these are often labeled as fungal plant diseases. And they are not fungi and they are not disease causing, but they are an indicator of the plant dying when they start to proliferate and actually take over the plant to decompose it, really. And so we want to reduce the conditions for these to flourish and encourage other organisms such as fungi and various protists that feed on bacteria and fungi to actually proliferate in order to balance the ecosystem, to feed the plant and to defend it against any pathogens. In the actual potting mix, there is very low biodiversity of organisms, and mostly there's bacteria in that potting mix, and it needs to have also fungi and predators of the bacteria and fungi in order for the ecosystem to function well. Also, the dam water was examined, and in there was also no pathogenic kind of organisms found, mostly ciliates, gorgeous ciliates, such as the one that you can see swimming here in this video now. The dam water is not likely to be a problem biologically, but there might be some contaminants, such as various herbicides that might have run off from a neighboring farm, for example, that are causing the problem. Or there might be some extra nutrients that might be too much for the plant to handle. So It's just a matter of examining the water as well and modifying the biological and water regime in the nursery. And I would suggest inoculating the potting mix with some lovely microbial mix that comes from a very well-made vermicompost. And once that's inoculated, the nutrient cycling will naturally kick in and feed the plant, but also protect the plant from any pathogens that might be about, and actually provide good immunity and good nutrition to the plants. Okay, so I hope that explains the mysterious nematode conundrum in the Pongamia plant nursery.